The day was unremarkable, just like most of Officer Linda Hawthorne's patrols. She scanned the quiet streets from her cruiser, taking in the well-kept lawns and rows of picture-perfect homes. This was her territory, a suburban neighborhood she'd come to know well over the years. She knew who belonged and who didn't. At least that's how she saw it. Linda had been with the department for over 2 decades, and while she had her share of complaints, she prided herself on keeping the peace, but Linda's version of peace had always been selective. It wasn't something she'd admit openly, even to herself, but her judgment often veered toward biases she'd learned growing up. She came from a small town where people whispered behind closed doors, holding firm to certain beliefs about people they didn't see every day. And Linda, though she'd moved to a bigger city for her career, had never let go of those early impressions. She'd been taught to look out for troublemakers, and to her, they often looked a certain way. Her eyes narrowed as she drove slowly down a main street in the affluent suburb. It was early afternoon, a time she usually reserved for circling the blocks where she knew most families were at work or school. The calm of the neighborhood, the routine, the sense of order, it gave Linda a sense of purpose. She relished her role as protector, even if it meant jumping to conclusions now and then. In her mind, it was better to act on a hunch than to let anything slip through the cracks. As she turned a corner, something caught her eye. A black luxury sedan, sleek and polished, was parked by the curb outside a large house with a perfectly manicured lawn. Linda slowed her cruiser to a crawl, eyeing the vehicle suspiciously. It wasn't the car itself that bothered her. She saw expensive cars all the time around here, but the driver, who was sitting inside, caught her attention. A black woman, elegantly dressed, was talking on her phone in the driver's seat. She seemed focused on her conversation, completely unaware of Linda's gaze. But Linda felt that familiar prickling of suspicion. In her mind, this woman didn't belong here. Linda's pulse quickened. She'd encountered a few people over the years who she felt didn't fit the mold of this neighborhood. Sometimes they were just delivery drivers or real estate agents, but Linda had her own internal radar. And today it was beeping loud and clear. Her fingers tightened on the steering wheel as she pulled to a stop a few yards behind the car, watching. Probably casing the place, she muttered to herself, shaking her head. Linda's instincts told her something was off. She didn't consider that it could be her own prejudice whispering in her ear. She only knew she felt uneasy, and to her, that was reason enough to investigate. She grabbed the radio, calling in her location and announcing her intention to make a routine check. She didn't say anything about her suspicions, didn't mention her gut feeling, but she knew her tone would be understood by dispatch. This wasn't the first time she'd reported something suspicious, and her colleagues were used to her methods. She turned off the radio and stepped out of the car, adjusting her belt and straightening her uniform. Her expression hardened as she approached the sedan, trying to look as authoritative as possible. Her heartbeat steadied, her confidence growing as she stepped into her usual role. To Linda, moments like these were where she thrived, commanding attention, exercising control. As she neared the driver's side, she cleared her throat loudly, aiming to get the woman's attention. The woman inside looked up, startled, then quickly put her phone down, rolling down the window as Linda leaned in slightly. "Is there a problem, officer?" the woman asked, her tone polite but firm. Her eyes were clear, unafraid. Linda felt a flicker of irritation. Most people would be at least a little uneasy under the scrutiny of a police officer, but this woman's composure only fueled Linda's suspicion. "May I see your ID and registration, please?" Linda said, her voice clipped. The woman raised an eyebrow. "Is there a reason you're asking, officer?" Linda bristled at the question. She wasn't used to being questioned herself, especially not by someone she already suspected. "We've had some reports of suspicious activity in the area," she lied smoothly, her eyes never leaving the woman's face. "Routine check." The woman sighed, a subtle but clear indication of frustration. Without another word, she reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet, handing over her ID along with the registration for the car. Linda barely glanced at the documents before looking back at the woman, her suspicion refusing to subside. "Alyssa Daniels," Linda read aloud. The name didn't mean anything to her, and she didn't care to think on it. "Do you live here, Ms. Daniels?" The woman's face remained calm, but Linda noticed a slight tightening around her eyes. "I don't see how that's relevant, officer." Linda's jaw clenched. She didn't like being challenged, not when she was trying to do her job. To her, This was a routine procedure. There was no reason for this woman to be difficult. Listen, Linda said, her tone growing sharper. I asked a simple question. If you live here, just tell me. If you're visiting someone, I need to know that too. It's for your safety and the safety of this community. Alyssa took a deep breath. I'm a state senator, she said, her voice even. I'm here for a private meeting, which I don't feel obligated to explain further. You have my IDA, and I'm not violating any laws. Linda froze, momentarily thrown off by the revelation. A senator? Her eyes flickered to the ID in her hand, and for a brief moment she felt the stirrings of doubt. But she quickly squashed it, her pride and instinct for control taking over. Well, MS. Daniels, she replied, emphasizing the title with a hint of sarcasm. Whether you're a senator or not, I still need to make sure everything is in order. We can't be too careful. Alyssa's calm demeanor didn't waver, but there was something in her eyes that seemed to pierce right through Linda. She met Linda's gaze directly, with an unwavering firmness that only deepened Linda's discomfort. This woman wasn't intimidated, wasn't showing the deference Linda expected. And that made Linda feel small, powerless, two sensations she hated more than anything. I've answered your questions, Officer Alyssa said quietly. Is there anything else, or am I free to go? Linda's face hardened, her pride stung by Alyssa's refusal to cower. She knew she should let this go, walk away and call it a day. But something within her, whether pride, bias, or a twisted sense of justice, refused to let her back down. Alyssa's calm, her confidence, felt like an affront to Linda's authority. Step out of the vehicle, MS Daniels, Linda said, her tone icy. Alyssa's expression didn't change, but Linda saw a flicker of disbelief cross her face. Excuse me. You heard me, Linda replied, her voice growing more forceful. Step out of the car. I need to conduct a search. The woman sat still for a moment, clearly assessing her options. Linda could see the anger simmering beneath the surface, but Alyssa remained composed. After a long pause, she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out slowly and deliberately, as though she were controlling every muscle in her body. As Alyssa stood before her, taller than Linda had anticipated, the officer felt a pang of uncertainty. But she couldn't back down now, not after insisting on this course of action. Her grip on her authority felt like it was slipping, and she would do anything to keep it from loosening further. She was Officer Linda Hawthorne, a woman who had never lost control, and she wasn't about to start now. As Senator Alyssa Daniels stepped out of her vehicle, the tension in the air seemed to thicken, clinging to both women like a heavy mist. Alyssa stood tall, her posture immaculate, refusing to show any hint of the unease simmering beneath her calm facade. She had faced situations where her authority and intelligence were questioned countless times, but this felt different. The resentment in the officer's eyes was unmistakable. Linda took a step back, her hand instinctively drifting toward her belt where her handcuffs dangled, a reflexive gesture meant to remind her of her own power. Face the car, ma'am, she instructed, her voice cold and steely. Alyssa's brow furrowed slightly, her calm cracking just enough to reveal a hint of exasperation. Officer, I've complied with every request so far. You've seen my ID, and you know who I am. There's no reason for this to continue. Linda ignored her, motioning toward the car. I won't ask again. Please face the vehicle, hands on the hood. Alyssa took a steadying breath, her gaze flickering toward the few bystanders who had stopped to watch from across the street. She felt a pang of humiliation, realizing that people she represented in her role as a senator were witnessing this moment, seeing her subjected to this treatment. But more than that, she was angry at being reduced to just another suspect in the eyes of this officer, despite everything she had achieved and the respect she had earned. Officer, this is unnecessary, she repeated, her voice calm but laced with warning. There's nothing in my vehicle and you have no grounds for a search. Linda's jaw tightened. The voice in her head, the one that usually whispered suspicions and trust your gut mantras, was now screaming for her to assert her control, to show this woman who was in charge. Ma'am, if you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to detain you, she said, her tone final. Alyssa felt a knot of anger form in her stomach. This was no longer a simple traffic stop, it had turned into a struggle for dignity, a struggle to be seen as more than her skin color or her position. Her gaze drifted toward the sky for a brief moment, searching for patience before she finally turned and placed her hands on the hood of her car, feeling the cold metal press against her palms. Linda felt a perverse sense of satisfaction as she watched Alyssa comply. She approached cautiously, patting down the senator with quick, efficient motions. The air between them was thick with silent resentment, a battle of wills playing out in every gesture. Linda could feel the eyes of the bystanders on her, but she ignored them, more concerned with maintaining her sense of authority than with the scrutiny of strangers. "Anything sharp or dangerous on you?" Linda asked, her voice monotone as she moved her hands across Alyssa's pockets. She knew the question was redundant, even absurd, given Alyssa's appearance and credentials. But protocol was protocol, and Linda was clinging to that as her justification. Alyssa shook her head slightly, choosing to remain silent rather than dignify the question with a response. She had nothing to hide, nothing to prove, yet here she was, enduring this indignity in the name of keeping the peace. Finished with the search, Linda stepped back. "You're clear," she said, her voice lacking any hint of apology or acknowledgement of Alyssa's cooperation. "You can turn around." Alyssa did so, her expression unreadable but her eyes brimming with a quiet defiance. She stood tall, folding her arms across her chest as she looked Linda directly in the eyes, refusing to flinch or back down. "Are we done here, officer?" she asked, her tone firm, almost challenging. But before Linda could respond, the sound of a car door slamming nearby caught their attention. A young woman, likely in her 20s, approached with her phone held up, recording the interaction. Her expression was one of outrage as she walked up to the scene, her gaze darting between Linda and Alyssa. "What's going on here?" the woman demanded, her voice loud enough to draw even more attention from passers-by. "Why are you treating her like this? She hasn't done anything wrong." Linda's face flushed with irritation as she turned to face the newcomer. "Step back, ma'am," she ordered, her tone sharp. "This is a routine stop. Please don't interfere." But the young woman didn't back down. Instead, she looked at Alyssa, her phone still trained on the scene. "Ma'am, do you want me to keep recording?" she asked, her voice softer now, filled with genuine concern. Alyssa hesitated, glancing at the phone, then at Linda. She felt an inner conflict, torn between wanting to de-escalate the situation and the desire to expose what was happening. But she knew the risks, the ways things could spiral if she provoked Linda further. So she nodded to the woman, her voice calm. "Thank you. I think that would be wise." Linda's irritation flared into anger as she realized that she was being recorded. Her face grew red, but she forced herself to remain composed, to not let her frustration show. This wasn't how she'd planned for this interaction to go, and now she was feeling the weight of the audience that had formed around them. She could feel the judgment in their eyes, their silent accusations, and it only fueled her resentment. "Ma'am, you're free to go," Linda said abruptly, her tone clipped as she took a step back from Alyssa, trying to regain her sense of control. But Alyssa didn't move. She remained standing, her gaze steady and unyielding as she looked Linda in the eyes, holding her ground. "Thank you, officer," she said, her voice calm and measured. "But I'll be filing a complaint. This was unwarranted and deeply unprofessional." The words stung, even though Linda tried to brush them off. She wanted to respond, to defend her actions, but under the weight of the cameras and the watchful eyes of the bystanders, she found herself momentarily at a loss for words. She forced herself to look away, a small pang of shame prickling at the edges of her mind. She'd come here with the intent to exert her authority, to establish her control, but somehow she felt as though she had lost. Without another word, Linda turned and walked back to her cruiser, her steps heavy. She didn't look back at Alyssa, didn't acknowledge the young woman with the phone. She simply got into her car, gripping the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white with tension as she stared straight ahead, ignoring the murmurs of the crowd. As she drove away, her mind raced with conflicting emotions: anger, frustration, shame, and a lingering sense of defiance. She told herself that she had done nothing wrong, that this was just another routine stop, that the senator had been the one to escalate things. But a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that she had crossed a line, that she had acted out of something darker and more insidious than mere suspicion. Meanwhile, back on the street, Alyssa stood watching as Linda's cruiser disappeared down the road. She felt a surge of relief, but it was tempered by anger and exhaustion. She'd dealt with situations like this before, but each time it felt like a new wound, a fresh reminder of the biases that permeated even the most mundane aspects of her life. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as the crowd began to disperse, some of them offering her sympathetic glances or quiet words of support. The young woman with the phone approached her, lowering her device. "Are you okay, Ma? I am," she asked softly, genuine concern in her eyes. Alyssa managed a small, grateful smile. "Thank you. I'm fine," she replied. "But this isn't over." With that, she turned back to her car, her resolve hardening. She knew what she had to do, and this time she wasn't going to let the matter slide. There would be accountability, not just for herself, but for everyone who had watched this happen, who had felt the weight of injustice in that moment. As she climbed into her car, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, a purpose that would lead her to take on a battle much larger than just herself. Linda's drive back to the station was far from peaceful. She gripped the wheel tightly, her mind spinning with flashes of the confrontation with Alyssa, the cold defiance in her eyes, the judgmental stares from bystanders, and that young woman recording everything with her phone. She felt her stomach churn with frustration. Who did Alyssa think she was, talking to her like that? Senator or not, Linda believed that her authority should be respected without question. The idea that anyone, especially someone she instinctively distrusted, would dare to undermine her was unbearable. "State senator," she scoffed under her breath as she pulled into the parking lot of the precinct. "Thinks she's better than everyone else." But as she cut the engine and sat in silence, another feeling began to settle in a sense of dread. Linda was too familiar with how public scrutiny could escalate, especially in an age where everyone carried a camera in their pocket, ready to capture a moment that could go viral. She had seen how quickly careers could be dismantled, how the smallest misstep could be magnified into something huge, and despite her best efforts to brush it off, she knew she might have overstepped. Linda pushed those thoughts aside as she entered the precinct, nodding briskly to her colleagues as she headed straight to her desk. She was about to file her report when her supervisor, Captain Miller, appeared in her peripheral vision, signaling her over. Miller's face was impassive but stern, the kind of expression Linda had come to recognize as business only. She followed him into his office, her heart hammering in her chest. As soon as the door closed, Miller turned to her, folding his arms across his chest. "Linda, I just got off the phone with City Hall," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Apparently you stopped a state senator today. Care to explain?" Linda felt her defenses shoot up. "Yes, sir," she replied, doing her best to keep her voice steady. "I conducted a routine stop. She looked out of place and I was concerned about potential suspicious activity. I was just doing my job." Miller's eyebrow lifted slightly, a hint of skepticism in his gaze. "Out of place? From what I've been told, she was sitting in her car outside a residential home, not causing any disturbance. What exactly led you to believe she was suspicious?" Linda's mouth tightened. She could feel her control slipping, but she wasn't ready to back down. "With all due respect, sir, I had a gut feeling. I've been on this job long enough to know when something doesn't feel right." "Gut feelings," Miller repeated, his tone tinged with disbelief. "Linda, do you realize the firestorm you may have just ignited? This woman is a senator. And not only that, but people were recording the entire encounter. We're already getting calls." Linda's face flushed with a mixture of shame and anger. The last thing she wanted was for her actions to be questioned, especially by her own boss. She bit back her frustration, forcing herself to stand her ground. "With all due respect, Captain," she said stiffly, "I believe I acted within the bounds of the law. She was uncooperative, and I made a judgment call based on the situation at hand." Miller sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, Linda, we both know this doesn't look good. A woman, a black senator, pulled over without cause and treated like a suspect in front of witnesses and cameras. The optics are bad, very bad." Linda opened her mouth to argue but stopped, her gaze shifting to the floor. She knew he was right, but part of her still felt that she hadn't done anything wrong. In her mind, she was just enforcing the law, doing what she believed was necessary. "Take a seat," Miller said, motioning to the chair across from his desk. "We need to discuss next steps." Linda sank into the chair, her jaw clenched tightly. She knew this wasn't going to end here. The situation had gotten too big, too fast. Her boss continued speaking, but her mind wandered, replaying the encounter with Alyssa over and over, trying to justify her actions to herself. Just then, her train of thought was interrupted by a knock at the door. Another officer stuck his head in, looking uncomfortable. "Sorry to interrupt, Captain, but she's here." Miller's gaze flicked to Linda before he nodded at the officer. "Show her in." The door opened wider, and to Linda's horror, in walked Alyssa Daniels, her expression as composed as ever but with a certain steel in her eyes. She wore a tailored suit, exuding a quiet authority that felt almost palpable. Linda's pulse quickened, and she could feel her palms growing clammy as she fought to maintain her composure. Captain Miller, Alyssa greeted, nodding politely to him before her gaze shifted to Linda, her expression cooling. "I wanted to address the incident that occurred earlier today." Miller stood, extending his hand, which Alyssa shook firmly. "Senator Daniels, thank you for coming in," he said, his tone professional. "I want to assure you that we take this matter very seriously. Officer Hawthorne has a strong record with the department, but we understand there were complications today." Linda felt a pang of anger at Miller's words. She hated that he was already framing the incident as a complication, like she had mishandled it. But as Alyssa began to speak, her frustration turned to something closer to dread. "Captain, I won't waste your time," Alyssa said, her voice clear and steady. "I am here to file an official complaint. Officer Hawthorne's treatment of me was inappropriate and unwarranted. I cooperated fully, and yet I was treated as if I were a threat. This isn't just about me, Captain, it's about the precedent set when people are profiled without cause." Linda bristled, her fists clenching at her sides. She could feel the urge to defend herself rising, but one look at Miller's warning expression silenced her. Instead, she sat silently, her anger simmering beneath the surface as she listened. Alyssa continued, "I understand that law enforcement is a difficult job, but as a public official, I cannot ignore the abuse of power I experienced today. This was a blatant misuse of authority, and I am prepared to pursue legal action if necessary." The words hit Linda like a physical blow, but she refused to show any weakness. She kept her face neutral, though her mind was racing with resentment and frustration. Legal action? This was turning into something far more serious than she'd anticipated. Miller nodded, his expression serious. "Senator Daniels, we take your concerns very seriously, and I assure you that this matter will be investigated thoroughly. We'll do everything we can to address it appropriately." Alyssa inclined her head slightly, her gaze flickering briefly to Linda. "Thank you, Captain. I hope that this will lead to real accountability. Too often, incidents like this are swept under the rug, and the people involved never face consequences." Linda couldn't take it any longer. She stood, her voice laced with a forced calmness. "Senator Daniels, I was simply doing my job. I've served this community for over 2 decades, and I treat everyone the same." Alyssa's gaze sharpened, and she looked Linda straight in the eyes. "If that were true, officer, we wouldn't be here right now. The way you approached me, the questions you asked, the way you escalated the situation, none of it was necessary. It wasn't your job, it was your bias." Linda felt her face flush, and her anger surged to the surface. But before she could respond, Miller held up a hand, silencing her with a stern look. "Officer Hawthorne," he said firmly, his voice holding a warning, "I think it's best if you step outside for a moment." Linda wanted to protest, to defend herself against what she felt was an unfair attack. But the look in Miller's eyes told her that arguing would only make things worse. She bit her tongue, nodding curtly before turning and leaving the room, her mind reeling with a mixture of anger and humiliation. As the door closed behind her, she could still hear Alyssa's voice inside, calm and steady, as she continued to outline her complaint. Linda paced the hallway, her fists clenching and unclenching, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel her anger bubbling up, threatening to boil over. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was the one in control, the one with authority. She'd been doing this job long enough to know what was best. At least that's what she kept telling herself. But somewhere, deep down, a small voice whispered a different truth, a truth she didn't want to acknowledge, a truth that gnawed at her pride and made her question everything she believed about herself and her role as a protector of the law. And as she stood there, waiting for the meeting to end, she felt that uncomfortable truth pressing down on her, a weight she couldn't shake. After a long and tense meeting with Captain Miller, Alyssa Daniels exited the precinct, her shoulders set and her face resolute. She could feel the stares of several officers as she walked down the hallway, but she paid them no mind. Her entire focus was on the series of steps she'd be taking next. This wasn't just about her. She was determined to use her platform to speak out against an issue she had encountered too many times and which so many others faced without recourse. Stepping out into the chilly evening air, Alyssa pulled her phone from her purse and dialed a number she knew by heart. The voice on the other end picked up almost immediately. "Hi, Ray," Alyssa said, her tone calm but with an unmistakable edge. "I need to arrange a press conference for tomorrow morning. Something urgent. Yes, all major media outlets, make sure they're there. This is a priority." As she ended the call, Alyssa took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs. She had always approached her role as a public servant with the intention of making change, but rarely had she needed to confront the very system she operated within so directly. Yet here she was, forced to address the kind of bias and abuse of power that she had long known existed but had hoped would improve over time. And now, the situation with Officer Hawthorne had brought it to her doorstep, both figuratively and literally. The next morning, as Alyssa prepared for the press conference, she was inundated with messages of support. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers reached out, expressing their outrage over her treatment. It didn't surprise her. She'd always known there were those who understood the experience, who felt the sting of judgment and prejudice. But the public outcry was larger than she expected, and it gave her a sense of validation and strength that she would carry with her to the podium. When Alyssa arrived at the steps of the city courthouse for the conference, a sizable crowd had already gathered. Members of the press clustered around, setting up their cameras and microphones. A mix of supporters and concerned citizens filled the space, holding signs and murmuring to one another as they waited for her to speak. The atmosphere buzzed with energy, a tension woven with hope and righteous anger. Alyssa stood behind the podium, looking out over the crowd. She could see the faces of people who had come, not just for her, but for something larger, a cause they knew had to be fought. She cleared her throat and began to speak, her voice strong and steady. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today," she started, her eyes scanning the crowd. "As many of you may know, yesterday I had an encounter with a law enforcement officer that left me deeply concerned, not just for myself, but for everyone who has faced similar treatment without the platform or resources to speak out." Her words rippled through the crowd, murmurs of agreement echoing back at her. She continued, her voice growing more forceful. "What happened to me was not an isolated incident. It's part of a broader issue that we can no longer afford to ignore. This is about accountability and ensuring that those who serve the public do so with fairness, respect, and integrity. No one, no matter their background, status, or appearance, should be subjected to treatment that is rooted in bias or prejudice." The cameras flashed, capturing the fire in Alyssa's eyes. She knew her words would reach far beyond this immediate crowd. She was speaking to a much larger audience, one that included people who might not have thought deeply about these issues before. "I am calling for a full investigation into the events of yesterday, and I am committed to ensuring that steps are taken to prevent this from happening again. This isn't just for me, this is for every citizen who has ever felt marginalized or targeted without cause. Our communities deserve better." Alyssa's voice rang out over the crowd, firm and unyielding. She could feel the weight of her words, the sense of responsibility she held as a representative, and, in this moment, as a voice for so many others. As she finished, a young journalist raised her hand, her eyes wide with curiosity. Alyssa nodded, granting her permission to ask her question. "Senator Daniels, what specific actions are you planning to take following this incident? Are you planning to pursue legal action?" Alyssa nodded thoughtfully before answering, "Yes, I am considering all options, including legal action. But my primary focus is on ensuring that our law enforcement agencies are held to the highest standards of conduct. I will be working with state officials and community leaders to push for measures that address profiling and ensure that all citizens are treated fairly under the law." The crowd responded with a surge of applause, and Alyssa felt a wave of pride. This was more than just words, it was the beginning of something larger, something she knew she was meant to fight for. As the press conference concluded, Alyssa made her way through the crowd, shaking hands and thanking people for their support. She could see the relief and gratitude in their eyes, the unspoken understanding that her actions were not just for her own sake, but for everyone affected by systemic injustice. She lingered for a while, speaking with those who approached her and listening to their stories that mirrored her own experience and reinforced the importance of her mission. Afterward, as she sat alone in her office, a sense of calm settled over her, but her resolve only grew stronger. She was more certain than ever that this incident was a turning point, a moment that would drive her to fight even harder for change. She began to make calls, reaching out to legal advisors, civil rights organizations, and community advocates. She was assembling a coalition, one that would be powerful enough to challenge not only Officer Hawthorne's actions but also the broader issues at play within law enforcement. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, the aftermath of Alyssa's press conference hit Linda like a punch to the gut. She watched the coverage from her desk, her face paling as she heard Alyssa's words replayed over the airwaves. The public backlash was swift and unrelenting, and she could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, some sympathetic, others disapproving. Linda tried to keep her head down, to focus on her work and ignore the whispers that followed her every step, but she could sense the shift in the atmosphere, the quiet judgments, the subtle distance her colleagues kept as they avoided eye contact or steered conversations away from her. The camaraderie she had once felt with her fellow officers was slipping, leaving her isolated in a sea of scrutiny. The station's leadership was also under pressure, receiving calls from local politicians, community leaders, and concerned citizens, all demanding answers. Linda was called into yet another meeting with Captain Miller, but this time the tone was different. There was no attempt to soften the blow, no hint of understanding. Linda Miller said, his voice clipped, "This situation has escalated far beyond what any of us anticipated. The department is facing serious backlash, and frankly, we're left with very few options." Linda's mouth went dry, her stomach churning as she sensed what was coming. "Captain, I was just following protocol," she argued, her voice lacking its usual conviction. "I didn't do anything wrong." Miller shook his head, a look of disappointment flashing across his face. "That's not how it's being perceived. Whether or not you intended it, your actions are being seen as discriminatory, and the department has to respond." He sighed, rubbing his temples before continuing. "For now, you're being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. We'll conduct an internal investigation, but I want you to understand that there's no guarantee of how this will end." Linda felt a surge of panic. "Captain, please, I've been with this department for years. You know I'm not like that. I was just doing my job." Miller's gaze softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "Linda, we're all under scrutiny now. The only thing we can do is try to show the community that we're willing to hold ourselves accountable. You need to take this time to think carefully about your actions and what they mean." Linda stared at him, her heart pounding as the reality of her situation sank in. She had always seen herself as a dedicated officer, someone who upheld the law and kept her community safe. But now, faced with the fallout of her own actions, she found herself questioning everything. The authority she had once taken for granted, the power she had wielded so confidently, it all felt hollow and uncertain. As she left the precinct that evening, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, frustration, shame, and a gnawing sense of guilt she couldn't ignore. She didn't know what the future held or if her career could ever recover from this. All she knew was that her life, much like Alyssa's, had changed in an instant, and there was no going back. The video of Alyssa Daniels' confrontation with Officer Linda Hawthorne spread across social media like wildfire. Clips from Alyssa's press conference added fuel to the fire, making the situation impossible to ignore. Within days, news outlets nationwide were reporting on the incident, framing it as yet another example of unchecked bias within law enforcement. Headlines ranged from state senator mistakenly targeted by police to racial profiling hits new heights as officer harasses black state senator. Alyssa's composed face and Linda's tense expression became symbols of a deeper issue, replayed on screens across the country. Linda watched in horror as the media coverage intensified. Each new report seemed to dissect her actions in painstaking detail, scrutinizing every word, every gesture, every choice she had made during that encounter. Talk shows debated her motives, with commentators weighing in on what they believed her true intentions had been. Some defended her, citing the difficulty of her job and the gut instinct she claimed to have acted on. But most condemned her, calling her behavior a stark example of the bias embedded within the system. Each harsh critique felt like a blow, chipping away at her sense of identity and purpose. Social media platforms were flooded with discussions, hashtags like Justice for Alyssa and Reform the Police trending for days. People shared their own experiences with racial profiling, recounting moments of humiliation and fear that echoed Alyssa's experience. There was anger, frustration, and a growing demand for change that couldn't be silenced or brushed aside. For many, this wasn't just about Alyssa, it was about a system that had failed them, a system that needed to be held accountable. The pressure on the police department was immense. Community leaders called for immediate action, demanding that Linda be fired and that a thorough review of the department's policies be conducted. The mayor publicly voiced her support for Alyssa, acknowledging the need for systemic reform. Linda's fellow officers, once her allies, began to distance themselves, avoiding eye contact and rarely speaking to her. She felt like a pariah, her decades of service reduced to this single incident in the eyes of the world. In the meantime, Alyssa received a flood of support from her constituents and colleagues. Many sent letters, emails, and messages expressing their outrage and solidarity, commending her for standing up and speaking out. Alyssa found herself at the center of a movement that was gaining traction with each passing day, a movement that called for real, tangible change. She didn't take the support lightly, understanding that her actions now had the potential to affect countless lives beyond her own. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her, but it only strengthened her resolve. Determined to make this moment count, Alyssa met with civil rights organizations, community leaders, and even other politicians who shared her vision for reform. Together, they drafted a series of policy proposals aimed at addressing bias in policing. The initiatives included mandatory anti-bias training for officers, the implementation of body cameras, and the establishment of an independent oversight committee to review cases of alleged misconduct. Alyssa was relentless in her pursuit, determined to ensure that the painful experience she had endured would lead to something meaningful. One evening, Alyssa sat in her office, reviewing the latest draft of the proposed legislation. Her assistant, Maria, knocked lightly on the door before entering, a concerned look on her face. "Senator, there's something you should see," Maria said, holding out her tablet. Alyssa looked up, feeling a pang of unease. "What is it?" Maria handed her the tablet, her expression somber. "Officer Hawthorne's made a public statement. It's ... intense." Alyssa took the tablet, her curiosity piqued. The screen displayed a video of Linda, sitting alone at a table in what looked like her own living room. Her face was drawn, her expression weary, as if the weight of the past few weeks had worn her down to her core. Alyssa pressed play, watching as Linda began to speak. "This isn't easy for me," Linda's voice cracked slightly, betraying the emotion behind her carefully chosen words. "I've served my community for over 2 decades. I've made sacrifices, taken risks, and faced more challenges than I can count. The first never imagined that my entire career could be reduced to one incident." She took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering as she continued. "I know that my actions that day were wrong. I acted out of fear, out of a sense of control that I now realize was rooted in something deeper. Something ... that I didn't want to see in myself. I've spent my life believing I was on the right side, that I was protecting my community. But the truth is, I failed that day. I failed Senator Daniels, I failed myself." Alyssa felt a mixture of surprise and cautious empathy as she watched Linda's confession. She had expected the officer to double down, to defend her actions as just another part of her job. But instead, Linda was admitting fault, exposing a vulnerability that few in her position would dare to reveal. "I've had to look in the mirror every day since that incident," Linda continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I've questioned everything I thought I knew about myself and my role in this world. I know that an apology won't undo the harm I caused, but I hope it's a start. I'm willing to face whatever consequences come, and I'm committed to learning and doing better. I just ... I'm sorry." The video ended, and Alyssa sat in silence, the weight of Linda's words settling over her. She wasn't sure how to feel. On one hand, Linda's admission of guilt felt like a small victory, a recognition of the pain and humiliation Alyssa had endured. But on the other, she couldn't ignore the fact that this moment of self-awareness had come too late, only after Linda had been forced to confront the consequences of her actions in such a public and devastating way. Alyssa set the tablet down, her thoughts swirling. She knew that Linda's apology would resonate with some, that there would be those who believed she deserved forgiveness. And maybe, in time, Alyssa could come to forgive her as well. But for now, her focus remained on the larger goal, the need to enact real change, to address the deep-seated issues that went far beyond any one person or apology. The next day, Alyssa met with her coalition of supporters and announced the launch of a campaign to push her proposed reforms through the state legislature. She addressed the media once more, calling for the public's support and urging people to hold their leaders accountable. She spoke with a renewed sense of purpose, her words resonating with an audience that had been moved by her resilience and determination. As she looked out at the sea of faces, Alyssa felt a surge of hope. This was more than a response to a single incident, it was a call to action, a chance to make a lasting impact on a broken system. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she knew that she would continue to fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been overlooked, judged, or mistreated. Linda, meanwhile, remained on administrative leave, her career hanging in the balance as the investigation into her conduct continued. She spent her days reflecting on her choices, haunted by the realization that her sense of duty had been warped by a bias she had never wanted to acknowledge. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: she could never return to her old ways. The experience had changed her, leaving a mark that she would carry for the rest of her life. In the end, both women were left to navigate the fallout of their choices, each on a path shaped by a single moment that had altered the course of their lives. For Alyssa, it was a moment of painful truth that propelled her toward justice. For Linda, it was a harsh reckoning, a reminder that the power she once wielded came with a responsibility she had yet to fully understand. And as the world watched, both women stood as symbols of a system in desperate need of change, a system that, perhaps, was finally ready to be re-examined and rebuilt. Alyssa's call for change resonated far and wide, galvanizing communities, advocacy groups, and individuals who had long felt marginalized or unjustly treated by the very system meant to protect them. Within days of the press conference, petitions began circulating, demanding that Officer Linda Hawthorne be removed from her position. Social media flooded with hashtags calling for accountability, and Alyssa's office received an overwhelming number of letters and emails from citizens sharing their own painful stories of profiling and harassment. The movement Alyssa had ignited quickly became larger than her own experience. It became a platform for people who had been wronged to share their voices and demand reform. Alyssa worked tirelessly, coordinating with advocacy groups to ensure that the push for policy change gained traction. She didn't shy away from the spotlight, attending rallies and town hall meetings, where she spoke passionately about the necessity of structural reform within law enforcement. The legal side of the battle was equally intense. Alyssa's legal team filed an official lawsuit against Officer Hawthorne and the police department, alleging racial profiling, unlawful detention, and violation of civil rights. The lawsuit sought damages but, more importantly, demanded that systemic reforms be implemented. Alyssa was clear this wasn't just about punitive measures against Linda, it was about creating a lasting impact that would protect citizens from future abuses of power. The lawsuit and its demands for reform set off a firestorm within the police department. Captain Miller and other department heads scrambled to address the mounting criticism and the intense public scrutiny bearing down on them. The department was caught in a delicate balancing act, trying to appease the public while maintaining morale among the officers. Some within the force supported Alyssa's calls for reform, recognizing the value of accountability and self-reflection. But others, including some high-ranking officers, viewed her actions as an attack on their profession, a betrayal of the brotherhood they felt bound to uphold. Internal tensions grew. Officers who supported change found themselves ostracized, and the divide between those wanting reform and those clinging to the status quo became impossible to ignore. Officers who had once worked alongside Linda now kept their distance, not wanting to be associated with the controversy. Linda herself was overwhelmed by the isolation. Her closest friends within the department avoided her, and her reputation had shifted from respected veteran to pariah. Meanwhile, Alyssa continued her outreach, meeting with local communities impacted by law enforcement policies. She used her story to connect with them, listening to their experiences and assuring them that change was not only possible but imminent. At one town hall meeting, an older woman stood up, tears in her eyes, and shared how her son had been detained without cause years ago, scarred by the experience but too afraid to speak out. Alyssa held the woman's hand, thanking her for her bravery, feeling the weight of these stories adding urgency to her fight. The broader community was mobilized as well. Grassroots organizations organized marches and peaceful protests, filling the city's streets with people demanding justice and reform. The protests became a powerful force, and the local government felt the pressure mounting. The mayor, initially hesitant to take a definitive stance, eventually issued a public statement announcing plans to work with Alyssa on proposed changes, including anti-bias training, transparency initiatives, and the establishment of an independent oversight body to handle complaints against law enforcement. But as the movement grew stronger, so did the backlash. Groups opposed to Alyssa's efforts gathered, claiming that her actions endangered the morale of police officers and threatened public safety. Some members of the community feared that these changes would make officers hesitant to do their jobs, while others felt that Alyssa's actions were overly punitive. Counter-protests sprang up, with demonstrators holding signs that read, "Support our police and no reform needed." The divide within the community became stark, with people forced to pick sides in a battle they hadn't anticipated. Linda, still on administrative leave, watched the backlash from a distance. She tried to avoid the news, but it was impossible to escape the storm her actions had set in motion. The television flashed images of protests, debates on news programs dissected every detail, and op-ed articles weighed in from every possible angle. She felt trapped, her life now reduced to a single, irreversible mistake. Her family distanced themselves, too, caught between their loyalty to Linda and their discomfort with the actions that had led to this ordeal. At night, alone in her small apartment, Linda struggled with feelings of regret and resentment. Part of her wanted to believe that she was the victim of a system willing to cast aside one of its own for the sake of appeasement. But another part she had only recently begun to acknowledge understood that her own biases and unchecked assumptions had led her to make a grave mistake. The apology she had issued now felt like only the first step in a much longer journey, one that she wasn't certain she had the strength to complete. Linda had been contacted by lawyers, many of whom offered to defend her, framing her case as an instance of an officer being wrongfully vilified for doing her job. But despite the allure of these offers, Linda hesitated. Deep down, she knew that her actions had been wrong. Accepting that truth didn't erase the shame or resentment she felt, but it left her conflicted, unsure if she could go on defending herself while knowing she'd made a grievous error. Alyssa, on the other hand, was bolstered by the progress being made. Though exhausted, she felt a renewed sense of purpose each time she saw the impact her actions were having. The small victories, passing anti-bias legislation, securing funding for community programs, and gaining widespread support for oversight measures became fuel for her resilience. But she was also keenly aware of the backlash. Her office received hate mail, and she faced criticism not only from opponents of reform but also from those who claimed she was sensationalizing the issue for political gain. One night, Alyssa received an unexpected call from a woman who introduced herself as Linda's mother. The voice on the other end of the line was gentle, tired, and filled with a quiet desperation that struck a chord in Alyssa. "Senator Daniels, I don't mean to intrude," Linda's mother said softly, "but I thought you should know that Linda. She's struggling. I'm not asking you to forgive her or to change your course. I just wanted you to know that she's human too. She's in pain, and I worry she might lose herself in all of this." Alyssa sat silently, feeling a conflict within herself. She had been so focused on justice, on rectifying the harm done, that she hadn't fully considered the human cost of her pursuit. Linda's actions had hurt her, and she knew Linda needed to face the consequences. Yet, hearing the quiet plea of a mother, Alyssa couldn't ignore the complexity of the situation. "Thank you for sharing this with me, Mrs. Hawthorne," Alyssa replied softly. "I'll take your words to heart." The call left Alyssa pensive. She was not naive, she knew that this battle for reform was essential. But the conversation with Linda's mother lingered, making her think more deeply about the kind of impact she wanted to leave behind. The pain, the isolation, she knew that even as justice was pursued, compassion needed to be part of the journey. Days later, Alyssa spoke at a community gathering. She took a moment to address the personal toll this experience had taken, not only on herself but on everyone involved. "Accountability and compassion can coexist," she said, her voice calm but powerful. "This fight isn't about tearing people down, it's about building a system that lifts everyone up, that respects and protects all of us equally. My experience is not unique, and it's not just about me or Officer Hawthorne. It's about ensuring that, as a community, we grow stronger together." Her words resonated deeply, and for the first time there was a shift in the atmosphere. people began to understand that Alyssa's mission wasn't rooted in vengeance, but in the hope of building a more just society. She made it clear that change wasn't about vilifying individuals, it was about addressing a broader, more insidious issue. The impact was felt immediately. The intensity of the counter-protests softened, and the movement gained a new tone, one of reconciliation and unity, rather than division. Alyssa's words marked a pivotal moment, a chance for the community to move forward with both accountability and empathy. As Alyssa continued her work, Linda watched from afar, wrestling with the complex emotions that came with both regret and the faint hope for redemption. Alyssa's stance offered her a glimmer of relief, a sense that perhaps in some distant future, she could find a path to atonement. And in the wake of these events, the community began to heal, moving forward with a newfound commitment to justice, one that left room for both accountability and forgiveness. The days following the intense public outcry were among the most challenging in Linda Hawthorne's life. She'd spent decades as an officer, driven by a sense of duty, and now she found herself at the center of a firestorm she couldn't control. What had once been routine patrols, camaraderie with her colleagues, and a comforting rhythm in her life had all disintegrated. She was left alone, isolated not only from the world outside but also from the core of who she believed herself to be. Linda's home, once a place of peace, became a constant reminder of everything she'd lost. Her personal life was fraying at the edges. Her husband, who had supported her career for years, was growing distant. The rare conversations they had now were stilted, filled with strained silences and unresolved tension. She felt him watching her, his gaze filled with a mixture of pity and disappointment. He hadn't said anything directly, but she could feel it, the question hovering in the air between them: how could you let this happen? The sense of betrayal from her fellow officers cut even deeper. Officers she'd worked alongside for years, shared meals with, celebrated birthdays and retirements with, they were all turning their backs. Linda had tried to convince herself it was just the media's slant, that they were exaggerating her actions. But now, with her reputation tarnished and her own instincts under scrutiny, she felt more vulnerable than ever. She spent hours replaying the encounter with Alyssa in her mind, questioning each decision, wondering how things had spiraled so far out of control. One evening, after a particularly heated argument with her husband, Linda retreated to the bedroom and closed the door behind her, sinking onto the edge of the bed. She looked around the room, her gaze settling on her uniform hanging in the closet. It was freshly pressed, pristine, as if waiting for a day she might never see again. A wave of bitterness washed over her, but underneath it, something more profound, an ache, a hollow feeling she couldn't shake. Linda reached for her phone and found herself scrolling through the news, something she'd tried to avoid lately. Headlines and op-eds dissected her actions, painting her as a symbol of everything wrong within the system. Words like racist and oppressor flashed across the screen, each one a blow to her already fragile self-image. But it was a short video clip that finally stopped her, scrolling a snippet from one of Alyssa's recent speeches, where she'd spoken about her vision for a fairer, more just community. Linda's thumb hovered over the screen. She didn't want to watch, didn't want to see Alyssa standing there with that quiet confidence, speaking words that were slowly turning public opinion in her favor. But some part of her, a small but insistent part, pressed play. Alyssa's voice was calm, steady, filled with a quiet conviction that captivated Linda in spite of herself. True accountability means acknowledging our mistakes, Alyssa said, her voice carrying an undertone of resolve. But it also means creating space for people to change, to learn, to grow beyond those mistakes. This isn't about punishing individuals, it's about addressing the systems that shape us, the beliefs that influence us, and ensuring we do better as a society. Linda felt something stir within her, a strange mixture of guilt and relief. The realization was unsettling. It was as if Alyssa's words had cracked open a part of her that she tried to keep hidden, a part of her that recognized her own mistakes but had been too afraid, too proud to confront them. Later that night, Linda lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind flooded with memories, moments when she'd acted on assumptions without questioning them, times when she'd taken shortcuts or made judgments based on her own biases, however subtle. She remembered her early days in training, where seasoned officers would tell her, "Trust your gut." It never lies, she'd clung to that advice, believing that her instincts were unassailable, a shield against danger and uncertainty. But now she wondered if her gut had been influenced by something darker, a lifetime of small prejudices and unexamined beliefs that had built up over the years, shaping her in ways she hadn't fully realized. She thought of her parents, her upbringing in a small town where certain ideas were treated as truths, where she'd been taught to fear anything that felt different. Those teachings had become embedded in her, guiding her actions without her even noticing. And now those same beliefs had led her to this point, her career and reputation in ruins. Over the following days, Linda withdrew further, grappling with an internal conflict that left her raw and vulnerable. She felt as if she were peeling back layers of herself, exposing a person she didn't entirely recognize. In an attempt to confront these feelings, she started journaling, something she hadn't done since her teenage years. The pages filled quickly with her frustrations, her fears, her resentment toward Alyssa, and eventually her own sense of culpability. One entry stood out to her, scribbled in shaky handwriting late one night. "What am I afraid of seeing?" The question lingered in her mind, gnawing at her as she forced herself to confront the truths she'd buried for so long. She wasn't just afraid of losing her job or facing public scorn. She was afraid of recognizing that she had become someone she didn't want to be, someone who wielded authority carelessly, who acted on fear and prejudice rather than empathy and understanding. Driven by a need for clarity, Linda reached out to an old colleague, a retired officer named Sam who had once served as a mentor to her. Sam had always been level-headed, a calming presence during her early years on the force. She hadn't spoken to him in years, but desperation overrode her hesitation, and she arranged to meet him for coffee at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. When Linda arrived, Sam was already seated, his face weathered but warm as he gave her a nod of recognition. She slid into the booth across from him, feeling a surge of relief at the familiar presence. "Linda," he greeted her, his eyes kind but sharp, filled with a wisdom that made her feel exposed. "Thanks for meeting with me, Sam," she said, her voice softer than she intended. She hesitated, unsure of where to begin, but finally she found the words. "I don't know who I am anymore. Everything I thought I knew, it's like it's all slipping away." Sam listened, his expression thoughtful. "I've seen the news, Linda," he said gently. "I won't pretend to understand everything you're going through. But if you're questioning yourself, that's a good start. It means you're not as lost as you feel." Linda looked down, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought ... I was protecting the community. But now, I don't know. Maybe I've been wrong about everything." Sam's gaze softened. "We all make mistakes, Linda, and we all have blind spots. The important thing is to confront them, to do the work to see past our own assumptions." She looked up, meeting his eyes, feeling a glimmer of hope. "But where do I even begin?" Sam leaned forward, his voice low and earnest. "By listening. By putting aside everything you think you know and listening to yourself, to others, to the people you might have overlooked. It won't be easy. In fact, it'll be one of the hardest things you'll ever do. But if you're willing to try, you might find a way forward." Linda nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over her like a fragile but comforting blanket. She wasn't sure if she could do it, if she could truly dismantle the biases she'd carried for so long. But for the first time, she felt a flicker of determination, a willingness to try, to start anew, no matter how painful or uncomfortable the journey might be. As they parted ways, Linda realized that she was beginning to understand something important. This wasn't just a reckoning with the world around her. It was a reckoning with herself, with everything she had ignored or dismissed in her pursuit of authority and control. That night, Linda sat down with her journal again, feeling a new sense of purpose. She wrote out a promise to herself, one she knew would guide her in the days to come. "I will listen. I will learn. And I will strive to become someone worthy of the trust I once demanded." And though the future remained uncertain, Linda felt, for the first time in weeks, a small but genuine sense of peace. Months passed, and the movement sparked by Alyssa Daniels's encounter with Officer Linda Hawthorne transformed from a single voice demanding accountability into a statewide call for reform. Alyssa's proposed legislation had evolved into a robust bill supported by advocates, lawmakers, and citizens who saw this moment as a chance to address the brokenness within the justice system. The bill included concrete policies aimed at preventing racial profiling, mandatory anti-bias training, oversight committees to investigate misconduct, and increase transparency in law enforcement actions. The journey toward justice was finally beginning to take shape. For Linda, the path had been equally transformative, though far more personal. She had been on administrative leave for several months, watching as her former life drifted further from her grasp. Her days were now filled with introspection and learning, and her nights were spent volunteering at community events, where she faced her community in ways she hadn't before. As she listened to people's stories and saw firsthand the struggles they endured, she began to understand how her actions had been a part of a larger, painful pattern. For the first time, she felt truly accountable, not because of her public apology, but because of the people she had come to know. One chilly autumn afternoon, Linda sat in a modest community center, a room filled with people from different backgrounds and walks of life. Alyssa was there as well, seated at the head of the room with several community leaders and activists. It was a community town hall, one of many that had taken place over the months, where people could speak freely about their experiences and contribute ideas for change. The room buzzed with nervous energy as Linda took a seat in the back corner, feeling small but ready to listen. When Alyssa's gaze fell upon her, Linda felt a momentary pang of fear. Their eyes met, and Alyssa's expression softened, her face showing neither judgment nor forgiveness but something else: recognition. In that moment, Linda understood that they were two people woven into the same struggle, each carrying a different piece of the burden, a shared responsibility to make things right. The meeting began, and one by one, people rose to share their stories. They spoke of being followed in stores, stopped without cause, and judged unfairly. Others shared accounts of positive experiences with law enforcement, small moments where officers had treated them with respect and compassion. It became clear that the issue was not just about individual actions, but about a culture and system that needed to be re-examined from every angle. After a pause, Linda took a deep breath, gathering her courage, and stood. Heads turned, and a hush fell over the room as people recognized her. She could feel the weight of their gaze, the skepticism in their eyes, but she pushed through the discomfort. "Thank you for allowing me to be here," she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I know my actions have caused pain, and I'm here to acknowledge that. I can't erase what happened, but I want you all to know that I'm committed to change. I came today to listen, to learn, and to find a way to be part of a solution, if you'll let me." She looked at Alyssa, who nodded almost imperceptibly, a small gesture of encouragement. Linda felt a glimmer of relief, a sign that perhaps she was on the right path. After the meeting, as people mingled and shared ideas, Alyssa approached Linda, her expression thoughtful. They stood in silence for a moment before Alyssa spoke. "Thank you for coming," Alyssa said, her tone warm but measured. "I can't pretend to know what it's like to be in your position, but I appreciate that you're willing to face this with an open heart." Linda felt a knot of gratitude and relief rise within her. "Thank you, Senator Daniels. I know I've made mistakes, and I'm committed to making amends however I can." Alyssa nodded, her gaze unwavering. "It's a start, Linda. I hope you continue to walk this path." They exchanged a silent understanding, one that acknowledged both the pain of the past and the possibility of a different future. It was a fragile bridge, but it was enough. The following weeks brought more progress. The legislation Alyssa had championed was on the cusp of passing, its momentum unstoppable. The community showed up in droves to support the bill, writing letters, attending rallies, and holding vigils in honor of those who had suffered under an unjust system. Alyssa stood on the steps of the state capitol building, delivering an impassioned speech that would later be broadcast nationwide. "This moment is not the end," Alyssa declared to the crowd. "It's a beginning where our voices are heard, where our rights are protected, and where justice is not a privilege but a promise. This bill is not just legislation, it is a commitment to accountability, fairness, and respect. We are changing the world step by step, for ourselves and for generations to come." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing across the city, filling Alyssa with a profound sense of hope and purpose. She had come full circle, transforming her personal pain into a movement that had united thousands. As she looked out over the crowd, she saw faces of every age, color, and background, each one a testament to the strength of their shared resolve. Meanwhile, Linda continued her own journey of accountability. She met regularly with community leaders, working to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the public. She began mentoring young officers, encouraging them to examine their biases and to approach their roles with empathy. Over time, she became an advocate for reform within the department, pushing for the policies she once would have dismissed as unnecessary. In one of these mentoring sessions, Linda addressed a room full of rookie officers, her words carrying a weight she hadn't felt before. "Your badge isn't just a symbol of authority," she told them. "It's a symbol of trust. And that trust can only exist if we respect the communities we serve, if we listen to them and hold ourselves accountable. I lost sight of that once, and I'm still working to earn it back. Don't make the same mistakes I did." The young officers listened intently, their faces reflecting a mixture of admiration and respect. Linda hoped that her story would serve as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the importance of humility and the power of change. One evening, after a long day of community meetings, Linda found herself at home, flipping through a stack of letters that had come in the mail. Most were from people she didn't know, strangers who had heard her story, who either condemned or praised her efforts toward change. But one letter stood out, bearing a name she hadn't seen in years: Sam, her old mentor who had first guided her through the painful introspection that led to her transformation. "Linda," the letter read, "you've taken the hardest step, and for that, I am proud of you. Accountability isn't about perfection, it's about integrity, about facing yourself even when it hurts. Keep going. The road will always be hard, but you are not alone." Linda read the words over and over, feeling a deep sense of gratitude and resolve. She folded the letter carefully, placing it in a drawer alongside her journal, a symbol of the journey she'd undertaken and the person she was striving to become. Months after Alyssa's bill had passed and reforms were put in place, the community held a celebration in the city square. It was a joyous event, filled with music, speeches, and a palpable sense of unity. Alyssa attended, mingling with supporters and thanking those who had stood by her side. She spotted Linda at the edge of the crowd, standing quietly, her expression a mixture of humility and gratitude. As the evening wore on, Alyssa found herself next to Linda, sharing a quiet moment amid the festivities. They didn't need words, their presence side by side was enough. They were both part of something larger than themselves, a movement that had taken on a life of its own, one that promised hope and healing for the future. As the crowd cheered and music filled the air, Linda and Alyssa shared a small, knowing smile. They had walked different paths to get here, paths filled with pain, regret, and growth. But now, standing together, they knew they were united in purpose. Their shared journey had transformed them both, and it was a journey that would continue long after this night ended. They parted ways as the celebration continued, each carrying the weight of their shared history and the promise of what lay ahead. In that moment, they understood that true redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about learning from it, building upon it, and creating a legacy of change that would last for generations to come.